Good morning, Chag Sameach. Nice to see everybody. Welcome to the Gold State. Lovely to have you here. This morning, it's great to see you. Happy. Today is Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. Translation: today is Sabbath. It's also the middle of the Passover holiday. So I hope everybody's had their fill of matzah. And yeah. Only Jews do this to themselves. They eat matzah and then they eat prunes and they want to know why they don't feel well, right? It's like try hitting the gas and the brake at the same time. See what your car does. Here's what we do. This morning, following our learning, is the adult bar and bat mitzvah. The adult bat mitzvah. We have 7 beautiful women who are celebrating their benot mitzvah, their bat mitzvahs. And I've met with them a couple times. Just a lovely group of people who have had a wonderful experience. They've learned for a year with Yossi, and they're here today to celebrate with their families. And it's an amazing group because if you'd pick them out, if Central Casting had picked these people out as a representation of the range of identity within our community, you couldn't have done better. It's just a marvelous group of people, of some who were raised Orthodox and didn't have a chance to have a bat mitzvah as a kid, others who were raised in Persia and didn't have a chance to have a bat mitzvah, others who became Jewish as adults. Just wonderful people. So they're going to do a bat mitzvah, they're going to read Torah. Anyone do this? Anyone have an adult? A lot of you do. So you're here, you know how to do this. So we're going to celebrate that this morning. And their families will all be here, so it'll be a sweet celebration. Passover resumes on Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday, right? Is that right? Yeah, Monday, Tuesday are holidays. So Monday is the 7th day, it's a quiet day. Tuesday is the 8th day, and we say the Yizkor prayers, so the memorial prayers. So if anyone is remembering a loved one, you come to Shul Tuesday morning. And the holiday ends at about 8:15 on Tuesday night. And then the pizza outlets of Southern California go nuts, because Jews are running quick. It's like having a smoker not have a smoke for a weekend, and Italian restaurants, pasta, pizza, gewalt. Anyway, and we begin this period called the Omer, which is the counting till the next holiday. So it's good to have you all here. Wish you we're having Torah study today? Good, in the youth lounge. Good, wonderful. Okay, terrific. And I'm sorry there was some miscommunication. For a while there wasn't going to be Torah study, then there was, and there wasn't, and there was. Now there is, so we're here. It's also an interesting coincidence today because it's Easter weekend. Yesterday was Good Friday, which I guess is Jesus' yahrzeit, as it were, right? And today there's a name for this Saturday. What's it called? There's a name for this Saturday. Is what? Sábado de Gloria. And then tomorrow is Easter Sunday, which is in the Christian story, the day of the resurrection, which is the holiest day of the year. For the Christian community. And because there's an overlap, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at their story today. Now, we're going to be looking at another faith tradition. So let's do this with some humility, okay? Let's understand that faith is deep and wide and broad and sophisticated, and we can't possibly capture it in an hour, although we're going to try to get a little bit of it. Let's also understand that faith is made up of many voices, just like ours is. And anyone who would try to explain Judaism in 45 minutes, you'd say, come on, right? But we're going to try to capture one element of it. And we're here not to decide that we're better, they're worse. It's not competitive faithing here. I want to hear their story, and I want to hear our story as well next to it. Because the two stories grew up together. And the strata of the Christian tradition, which I would like to look at today, is the most Jewish strata. Many different voices came into Christianity to form what we call Christianity in all of its complexity. Some of those voices were Roman, some were Greek, some were philosophical, some were later medieval and modern voices. I want to look back at the ancient Jewish voice that found its way into Christianity. And to me, the best source of that is the book of Matthew. Now, the Christian Bible, which is called the New Testament, the Christian Bible, begins with 4 versions of the Christian story. They're called the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, which is the first one in the Christian Bible, is not the oldest one, but it's the most Jewish of all of them. You'll see that in just a moment. And there are many different theories, first of all, about how Matthew got written. about who wrote it, because it's called Matthew, doesn't mean that Matthew wrote it. But there's different theories about how it got written, when it got written. The theory that I find most interesting, and I know if you know scholarship, you're going to say, but Rabbi, that's not what so-and-so says. I know so-and-so says something different, but this is the one that I like the best. Matthew is a Syrian Jew, a faithful Jew, and he lives in Syria, Damascus or Antioch, which is to the northeast of Israel, of Canaan. And he lives in a Greek-speaking Jewish community that's rather well off. And he's living at about the year 120, which is about the same time as the rabbis of the Mishnah were living in Eretz Yisrael. And the first struggle that Matthew is having is precisely the same struggle that the rabbis of the Mishnah are having. The temple, which was the core of Jewish life, the core of Jewish identity, the connection between heaven and earth, the temple has been destroyed by the Romans. The question is why? And what do we do next? What's the content? What's the core of Jewish identity now that the principal institution which connects us with God, connects us with our past, connects us with our identity is gone? The rabbis of the Mishnah are struggling with this as well. And that's where they begin to create what we call the Rabbinic Judaism, which is our Judaism. Matthew is struggling with this also. And Matthew comes into possession of a book. It might even be the Gospel of Mark, which is a shorter, more terse, cursory gospel. Or it could have been a different book which contains a sort of outline of the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And Matthew reads this book and he becomes convinced that this is the answer that he's been looking for. And he becomes convinced of a theory. And here's the theory that he's going to offer us. The Roman oppression was horrible. The Romans were murderous and cruel and brutal. And Jews, as they did in the Pesach story that you read last week, cried out to God, and God sent a Savior. God sent the Messiah. The Messiah arrived in the world and lived among us. And the Messiah, who was God's chosen one, not a supernatural creature, a man, a human being who was anointed by God to rescue his people. But two things happened. The Jewish people in Palestine, in Israel, where this Savior lived, where this rescuer lived, were so fractious and so disturbed, so broken themselves, they did not accept him. They rejected him. And the Romans were so brutal, they killed him. Imagine the Messiah came to the world and we killed him. So Matthew says, that's the reason why the temple gets destroyed. And the only saving grace, literally, is that before he died, he said to his followers, I'm coming back. Your job is to prepare the world for the return of the Messiah. And that's what Christianity is. It's a form of Judaism, an interpretation of Jewish life, whose purpose is to do tikkun olam in our language, to prepare the world for the return of the Christ, of the Savior. And that's what he interprets, the new purpose. And he writes a book. And the purpose of his book is not talking to Christians. There are no Christians. He's not talking to Romans. This book is entirely directed at Jews, trying to say, here is a new way to do Judaism, to fulfill this myth. Now, he directs this to Jews. At the same time, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the rabbis in Israel, are working on the Mishnah, and they're answering the question in a different way. They're going to say that the temple got destroyed both for geopolitical reasons and also because we were ready to move beyond having a God who lives in a house in Jerusalem. And here is a different way to do Judaism, to do tikkun, to do the same kind of repair in the world. That there are very distinct parallels between Matthew's Judaism and the Mishnaic Judaism, the Judaism of the Talmud. Except the rabbis have some differences about how they're going to look at this. And we're going to see the conversation between the two today. And in the conversation between the two, you're going to see the religious impulses that filled this second century Judaism. Okay? So take a look with me. Everybody okay so far? Ready? Now, Jews, like us, Most Jews have never read the Christian Bible, unless you're in a hotel room and the television doesn't work. And you can't find anything to read, you know. You read all your magazines on the airplane, and you open the top drawer, and there's a Bible, and you open it up, and you say, oh, what an interesting story. Most Jews have never read this, okay? So the Christian New Testament is a section of books that follows what we call the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and it adds the Christian story. The first 4 books tell the story of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and passion and resurrection. That's called the gospel, the good news. And then there's a book called Acts, which tells you what they did after he died. So you have 5 books. Does that sound familiar? To tell you the core story. And then you have a whole bunch of stuff written by a guy named Paul. We're not going to deal with that today. That's way too complicated for Shabbos morning, right? That's more like a whole Pesach, right? But today we're just going to look at Matthew. So Matthew says, look, so he's telling the story of this Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew never met Jesus. Matthew didn't live in the same era as Jesus. All he has in front of him is this book of Jesus' sayings and some of the events of his life. And he creates this narrative. He weaves a narrative, okay? So he says to him, he called to his 12 disciples. And you'll hear over and over again references. 12 disciples, right? Shtei Misrei mi Odeya. Shtei Misrei ani Odeya. Shtei Misrei Shivtaya. 12 tribes. 12 brothers of Jacob, right? 12 brothers of Jacob, 12 disciples. Get it? The 12 Jesus sent out charging them, go nowhere among the Gentiles. Enter no town of the Samaritans. Right? It's my Bubba used to say, like, stay away from the Goyim, right? That's what he's saying. Don't go there. That's not our that's not our task. What do I want you to do? Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? And preach as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. So what is Matthew's message? Matthew's message is, Messiah time is around the corner. I don't know if that's heard today. I understand there are some Jews who walk around going, Mashiach, Mashiach, Mashiach. But that's what these guys are. They're saying, Messiah is coming tomorrow. Get ready. Messiah is coming tomorrow. The world is ending tomorrow. History as you know it is ending tomorrow. And what will this new history look like? What will happen in the new age? Well, this is from the Sermon on the Mount, which is the sermon Jesus gave in Jerusalem when he first arrived, Erev Pesach, right? He made one trip to Jerusalem in his lifetime, turned out very badly. But before that happened, he gave a sermon, good sermon too, by the way, called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and he sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to preach to them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, that phrase, by the way, blessed are the, for the, if you read Psalm 1, Ashrei, right? Ashrei ha'ish, happy is the man who, right? We have in Psalm 145, which we say in Shul, Ashrei Yoshev Esecha, Od Yahalalu, Chasela, Ashrei Am Shekachalo, right? Ashrei means blessed are, happy is. Favored is the man who. This is a classic biblical phrase. And what is he saying? Those who are poor today will be rich tomorrow. Those who are downtrodden today, history is going to turn. History is going to turn. This is a classic Jewish thing. In fact, if we get into the synagogue in time for the Hallel, you'll hear this over and over again. Even masu habonim hayta lerosh pina. The stone that was rejected by the builders became the cornerstone of the monument. The poor, the downtrodden, the broken, they are the ones who have the real power in this world. Those who think they have the power, the Romans, who have the armies, who have the wealth, they're finished. It's also the Purim story, by the way, right? Haman and Mordechai, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they'll be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they'll be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The status that you occupy in this world will be reversed when Messiah comes. If you're down, you'll be up. If you're broken, you'll be healed. If you're powerful, you'll be made weak. You'll be punished. Because you've created a world of sin. You created a world of brokenness. That is Matthew's answer to what do we do? What do we do? Why did we lose the temple? We lost the temple because we didn't understand that this was our mission, that the Messiah time was coming. Now the rabbis have a very different idea of the same question. The rabbis are going to ask the very same question. Come in and sit down. If you stand up, you'll fall asleep, you'll get hurt. Come sit down. Come on. So a famous story in Talmud Gittin talks about what happened on the day the temple was destroyed, right? Very, very famous story. Rabbi Yochanan was the leader of the Pharisaic community in Jerusalem, right? He had himself smuggled out of the city by his students, right? Have me taken out of Jerusalem, make a coffin, I'll lie down in it. The disciples continued to carry the coffin until they got to Vespasian. Vespasian was the Roman general who's besieging the city. This is the rabbis' not answer to Matthew, but their counterpart. Where Matthew says the Messiah time is about to come, that's what's going to happen in the wake of the destruction. Rabbi Yochanan has a different idea, right? When they opened the coffin, Rabbi Yochanan stood up before him and said, "Peace to you, O king." At this point, a messenger came from Rome to Vespasian and said, "Caesar is dead, and the notables of Rome have made you head of state." So Vespasian, who's the general sent to destroy Jerusalem, is elected emperor of Rome. Remember the opening scene of the film The Godfather? In the opening scene of this is holy. In the opening scene of The Godfather, on the day of Connie's wedding, the day of the Godfather's daughter's wedding, any request you make of the Godfather, he'll observe. Remember that? The baker comes and says, I need citizenship for my son-in-law. And the undertaker says, I need revenge for my daughter's purity. And Frankie, what's his name, comes and says, I want the part in the movie. You know what I'm talking about? Yes. You got to understand, that's holy, come on. On the day that the emperor is crowned, you can ask him anything and he has to give you what you want. So what does he ask for? What does Rabbi Yochanan ask for? He could have asked for the city, but he doesn't. He asks for, he says, make a request and I will grant it. Rabbi Yochanan says, give me Yavne and its sages. The city's lost. What I want is an academy. I want an academy where I can carry on the teaching of my ancestors. Why? Because for Rabbi Yochanan, the temple was no longer the connection between heaven and earth. The temple had gotten so corrupt and so political and so broken as a religious institution, its destruction was not to be mourned. What was to be saved was the connection between heaven and earth, and that's no longer through the temple, that's through Torah. You're now going to build a Torah-centered Judaism. And if a Torah-centered Judaism is what you want, you don't need a Beit Mikdash, you need a Beit Midrash. You don't need a holy place where they torture, they kill animals as sacrifice. You need a place where people can gather to learn Torah. And so the rabbis want Yavne and its because that's going to be the saving remnant of the Jewish people, is going to be its books and the study of Torah. And that becomes the ideology that you find in Mishnah Avot, in Pirkei Avot. This is the very first section of Pirkei Avot, which is a book of the Mishnah, which sets out, it's the constitution of Rabbinic Judaism. And this is what it says. Moses received Torah at Sinai and gave it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, who gave it to the men of the great assembly. Now what he could have done is to spread it down, right? So the men of the great assembly gave it to the Tanaim, the early rabbis, who gave it to the Moraim, the later Talmudic rabbis, who gave it to the Saboraim, who were the first codifiers of the Talmud, who gave it to the Gaonim, who were the first great rabbinic leaders, who gave it to the philosophers, who taught it to Moses Maimonides, who taught it to Mordechai Kaplan, who taught it to Harold Schulweis, who taught it to me, and I'm here today teaching it to. So there we go. Direct from Moses to you, with not a break in the chain. And what is the core of that Jewish identity? Torah. Torah. So whereas for Matthew, the replacement of the Torah, the replacement of the temple, is going to be the arrival of the Messiah and the kingdom of heaven. For the rabbis, The remedy for the destruction of the temple is the construction of a rabbinic culture around the learning and observance of Torah. That's going to be the difference. That's the difference between the two. Now, what happens, what kind of Torah are we talking about? And here, Matthew is going to quote a wonderful, this Sermon on the Mount. So remember that Jeremiah, Jeremiah, not the bullfrog, the prophet. Jeremiah, I know that's what you were thinking. The prophet Jeremiah lived to see that. Would you like a chair? You look like you need a chair. There's one right over here. Please, want you to be like at home. Shabbat Shalom, good Pesach to you. Come on in. There we go. People should not eat matzah and try to stand for more than 5 minutes. It's really not good for you. It's never, terrible things could happen, right? Jeremiah witnessed the destruction of the first temple. And so he had to cope with the same set of issues 600 years before the second temple is destroyed. The same question of what kind of Judaism follows the destruction of its principal institution. And he offers this very interesting prophecy. Listen to this prophecy. A time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. Just in case you didn't get the reference, the name of the Christian Bible is New Testament. In Hebrew, it's called Brit HaChadashah, New Covenant. They're taking it right from Jeremiah. They're saying, that's the one we got, right? With the house of Judah, house of Israel, house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I espoused them. But such is the covenant I'll make the house of Israel after these days. I will put my teaching into their innermost being and inscribe it upon their hearts. So what's the problem? If I give you a law and say, don't do it, do this or don't do that, you either obey or don't obey. And more often than not, you don't obey, right? You say, I'm going to be a good Jew, and then you're walking by Delmonico's Lobster House, and before you know it, it's you and Louis the Lobster, right? And you see the rabbi, and you say, what's the old joke? What a nice way to serve a baked apple. You know that joke? Yeah. You don't know the joke? Ugh. There's two versions. One version is the guy orders a suckling pig, and it comes with an apple in his mouth. Rabbi walks in, and the guy says, look, Rabbi, look how they serve a baked apple. And the other one is that the rabbi walks in, and he says, what are you eating? And the man says, did you see me eat this? He says, yes, I watched you eat it. You watched me eat this? Yes, I watched you eat it. You were there to observe me eating this meal? He says, yes. Then I did it under rabbinic supervision. God bless my Jewish people. Now listen to Jesus' what? My dear, if you're going to fight sin, you got to know sin. Where you go, Bugsy Siegel robbed banks because that's where they kept the money. If I'm going to fight sin, I have to go where it's found, right? Right. Listen to Jesus' sermon now. Think about Jeremiah's prophecy, about placing the law into the hearts of the people, about changing people's hearts as the way to change their behavior, okay? And listen to Jesus' sermon, right? This is called the Sermon on the Mount, which was a sermon that Jesus delivered in Jerusalem 2 days before the crucifixion, okay? Right? Hang on just a second. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Law is Torah. Prophets is Navi. I haven't come to erase the Bible from the world. On the contrary, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. In other words, I'm not coming to tell you not to keep kosher. I'm coming to tell you the real meaning of kosher. I'm not coming to tell you not to make Shabbos. I'm coming to tell you the real meaning of Shabbos. Now listen to what he says. I tell you the truth until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not an iota, the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the Torah until everything is accomplished. Now here's how you know he's speaking to people who know Hebrew. Because in Greek, the word is iota. What is an iota? The letter iota is the letter I. It's a full-size letter. That sentence doesn't make any sense if you're talking about a full-size letter. That sentence only makes sense if you know that the equivalent of an iota in Greek, in Hebrew, is a yud. You get it? He says, I'm not going to erase a yud from the Torah. Now, if you know Hebrew, you know, oh, well, that makes sense, because a yud is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. That's how you know he's talking to people who know Hebrew, right? Anyone who breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. In other words, this Messiah thing that I'm bringing, this doesn't mean you stop observing Torah, he says. On the contrary, you just have to observe it right, okay? But whoever preaches and practices and teaches commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, he don't like us. Pharisees. Now, the question is, does he really not like Pharisees, or is that a later addition? We'll come back to that. And the teachers of the law, that's me, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now he's going to give you 3 examples. We're going to do a couple of them. Ready? You have heard it said to the people long ago, do not murder. All right, where did we learn that?
10 Commandments.
Where? 10 Commandments. Which one? 6, right. Good, thank God. Right? Number 6, you will not murder. And anyone who murders is subject to judgment. Now, look, watch what he's going to do. This is classic midrash. In other words, the form of this sermon, the way it's being expressed, would be totally familiar to a 1st or 2nd century rabbinic Jew. This is what rabbis talked about, right? I do the same thing sometimes. I say, you're going to go and clean your house for chumetz. I want you to do something else. I want you to clean your heart of chumetz. Right? And that's what rabbis say that even today, right? You have heard it say you will not murder. Jesus is going to say, look, did you need the Torah to tell you not to murder? You didn't know not to murder? Not murdering is a common universal human ethic. If the Torah had to come and tell us, thou shalt not murder, it must mean something else. What else could it mean? Watch the move. It's classic midrash. Anyone who murders will be subject to the judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Anyone who insults his brother is answerable to the court. So the commandment, thou shalt not murder, says Jesus, or Matthew's Jesus, is what? Not murdering, you knew already. What we're really trying to get at is what? Is that set of emotions and passions that precede an act of murder. What emotion would you say it is most often? Rage. In other words, when the Torah says you will not murder, what it's teaching us is control your rage, because it could lead to something. Now, it's a very interesting move. For one thing, does that make the commandment bigger or smaller, stricter or looser?
That's around the Torah.
Does that make the commandment stricter or looser? Looser? No, you still have stricter. Because look, I can be very angry at Doug as long as I don't kill him. The Torah is okay. The rabbis are okay with that, right? I work in a shul. I'm used to this, right? People being angry, right? The rabbis would say passions are passions. Control your behavior. Jesus is saying, if you're angry, you've violated the Torah's mitzvah. Now, you could call that siyag l'Torah, a fence around the Torah. Because what he's saying is, if you stop anger, you'll stop murder. The rabbi's problem with that is going to be, can you stop anger? Can you really stop anger? I mean, it's an interesting question, right? And can you really punish people for that? Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of fires of hell. Well, that all of MSNBC. Therefore, that's all of CNN, right? Therefore, if you're offering a gift at the altar and you remember your brother has something against you, leave the gift and go to the brother and be reconciled with your brother and then come and offer the gift. These seem like basic ethics, you see? But you see what he's doing? He is introjecting, putting inside of you the mitzvah, just as Jeremiah told you it should be, right? Look at the next one. Those of you who are old enough, remember that this is the one that got Jimmy Carter into trouble, right? Yes. You have heard it said, you will not commit adultery. All right away. Did you need the Torah to tell you that? Adultery is a violation of a marriage vow. The very taking of the marriage vow implies that you don't commit adultery. Right? right? But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, all the men in the room are going, right? No, I mean, that's a real problem for men, because men are typically pretty visual, right? Right? You walk along the street and a lovely young woman, I told you, I took my Zeta to the mall. Oliver Shum. Zeta was 96. He used to love getting out of the home. So in the afternoon, when I had time in the afternoon, I'd go pick him up, and I'd take Papa Sam over with Yona. You know, I would go take Papa. He was Yona's great-grandfather, my grandfather, and Papa Sam and Yona and I would go take a walk in Northridge Mall. There's this dad and this kid and this 96-year-old little man with a walker, and a little teenager with a little tubby-toppy and little shorty shorts comes walking by, and Zeta turns. I said, "Zeta?" He says, "You gotta look." You know? He said, "You don't look, you're a dead man." You know. I mean, but that, you see he's asking for something which is profound, and in some ways it's absolutely right. Although it's crazy utopian, right? If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. There'll be a lot of blind men in the world. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body, right? And the theory is given at the end of the book of Matthew. Listen to the theory now. Listen to the theory. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees. It's talking about rabbis, okay? You hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Right? That's a very interesting theory. He got it exactly right. Rabbis also want to heal your soul, but rabbis do it the opposite. What's the rabbinic way to do it? You stop people's behavior. You start with behavior, and then you introject the ethic. Here's a classic example. This is a very, very, very famous example of Jewish ethics from Mishnah Bava Metzia. Just as there is dishonesty, actually theft is the word in the Mishnah, in buying and selling, so there is wrong done by words. One must not ask, what is the price of the article, if he has no intention of buying. You're at the airport, and your flight you're on United, God forbid, and you've just gotten pulled off a flight. And you have hours and hours to kill until your flight comes, right? And you walk into a camera shop, and there's a kid selling cameras at the camera shop. And you have no intention of buying a camera, but you have a couple hours to kill. So you say, "Let me see that one over there. Show me how it works. Let me hold it." And you occupy this salesperson for some time because you're just trying to kill time. You have no intention of buying. Says the Talmud, you're not allowed to do that. Why not?
You're getting the person's anxieties up that he's going to be selling a camera.
You're raising his expectation that you're going to buy the camera. You're stealing his time. You're stealing opportunities for him to make other sales. But even if there's no one else in the store, you're not allowed to do it because you're stealing something else. What are you stealing? His hope. You're messing with him. You're manipulating him. Now, think of by the way, if you looked at this from the outside, if I was walking by and I see a fellow at the counter of a camera store, do I know that he intends or doesn't intend to buy the camera? This is purely a matter of my inner intention, right? And I have an impulse to do this, right? By the way, there is a very, very important application of this. If you shop online, but you want to go look at a product in the store, I think the least you can do is tell the salesperson, "I don't intend to buy, I'm just looking at it." Because at least that way you've declared your intention. But if you're one of these people that goes and says, "Show me how it works, tell me how it goes," and then you look online and Amazon has it for a third of the price, I think that's also, it's called ona'at devarim. It's stealing with words. Right? So think about what's going on here. The rabbis also want to change you. But the difference between rabbinic ethics and Jesus or Matthew ethics attack the inner life first, And by changing the inner life, you change the outer life. You clean the inside of the pot, and by that way, the outside of the pot gets cleaned too. Right? What are the rabbis trying to do? The opposite. You change people's behavior. If I tell you, don't steal that kid's time, don't raise that kid's hope, I create a relationship between you and the kid. See, the reason I can go in and mess with the kid is because I set up a hierarchy. I'm the customer. I can control him. I think I'm more important than him. I think my time is more important than his. But the moment I say, listen, I'm not buying today, I just want to take a look if that's okay, I set us on an equal footing. The rabbis went the opposite. They started with behavior and hoped that behavior would find its way inside. Look at Maimonides. Now Maimonides, of course, is 1,000 years later, but look at Maimonides. If you examine all the mitzvot, and Maimonides is never cavalier with words, all the mitzvot, that's a hell of a statement. You will find that they have one purpose: to strengthen character and offer discipline, guidance, and training in strengthening of moral character. Thus, the Torah forbids revenge, the bearing of a grudge. And by the way, the bearing of a grudge might be an internal thing, right? Why? To weaken the force of anger and aggression. The commandments, before the aged you will rise and honor the face of the elderly, that's in Leviticus, and honor your mother and father and mother in Exodus, are intended to do away with arrogance and provide humility. So Maimonides gives you the theory, and it's exactly what Matthew says it is. For the rabbis, you begin with empirical behavior, and that changes character. For Jesus, you start with character, and that changes behavior. You end up with this at the same place. The question is, which method is more true to human being, to the human condition? All right, Douglas.
What happens when the behavior becomes an end into itself?
Well, that's a problem, right? Look at the next section. That's exactly his critique. It's his critique, and it's going to be a constant critique within the Jewish tradition. If the behavior becomes ritually pedantic, and that becomes the only thing you're paying attention to, right? It's the person who steps on your foot at the supermarket trying to get to that jar of gefilte fish on the top of the thing because they're making Pesach. And you say, heck, wait a minute, right? That's the problem, right? When the behavior itself becomes an end in itself and not a means to the strengthening of character. That's what Maimonides was objecting to, and in a moment you'll see that the Baal Shem Tov objected to it also. So here's what I want, the reason why it's an important point is because Matthew's critique of Jewish observance is an old Jewish critique, and it's a problem within Jewish observance. He's right, it's a problem. Right? When you clean the outside of the pot and forget to clean the inside, which means you make yourself a really nice chumetz-free house, but you leave yourself a full chumetz soul, right? A sour, crummy soul, a soul full of sourness, then you haven't observed Pesach. You're still a slave, right? Okay, look at the next section, right? Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, this is a different section. This is not Sermon on the Mount anymore. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Every synagogue, in fact, many Sephardic synagogues still have Cathedra del Moshe, right? It's Moses' seat is the seat right next to the Aron Kodesh, okay? Presumably Messiah is going to come and sit there. So practice and observance whatever they tell you, but don't not what they do. Right? Listen to their teaching. The teaching's right, but don't do what they do. Why? For they preach but don't practice. Right? They bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, like $20 matzah, Shmura matzah, right? But they themselves will not move them with a finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by men. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Again, you have to be a Jew to understand that sentence, right? What kind of Jew is it? What kind of Jew is it who wears great big tefillin? No, don't say that. That's not true. Great big expensive tefillin and fancy long taluses, right? There's a certain kind of spirituality of a guy who has I have the biggest tefillin in the shul. Hoo-ha. Right? I'm such a man, I have big tefillin, Right? No. You get what he's saying. It's a very look, and this is a very. I was going to give this as a sermon here, Not tell anybody where it came from.
You were going to do this.
I was gonna do this tefillin. I
Would have
think.
been your last sermon.
No. If you say this.
I gave a big fill-in sermon.
Did
It
you?
was my last
Well, if it got you to California, it worked well, right? I think if you quoted this as a Hasidic master, they would listen to you. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's right.
Boomer said.
Boomer, right? Exactly right. Right, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue. I always think of high holidays when people call at the last minute and scream at me because they didn't get the seat they wanted. I'm in row H. Last year I was in row F. I said, listen, I can move you for $1 million, you know. The salutations in the marketplace and being called rabbi by men. But you're not to be called rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. So again, you have to understand the internal language of the Jewish people to understand what he's saying. Right? For you have one teacher and you're all brethren. And call no man your father on earth, you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called master, you have one master, the Christ, the Messiah. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted, but woe to the scribes. Now, listen to the same idea from an 18th century Hasidic master, right? Because this is a common critique. This is your question. If you say that behavior is the method by which I change the human being, you got to be very, very careful that the behavior doesn't become a goal in itself. Right? The obsessive religious behaviorism is a phrase that Heschel used. So here's the Baal Shem Tov of the 18th century, because the Hasidic tradition objected to the same thing. You're going to find this wild, but originally Hasidism was a revolt against orthodoxy. It was a revolt against orthodoxy because it said those Jews are practicing, but they're not hearing their own words. They're not absorbing, they're not changing in the way that the tradition wanted them to change. So here's the Baal Shem Tov. A mighty king sits on his throne, situated in the center of a huge palace with many halls, all of them filled with gold, silver, and precious stones. Those servants of the king who are far more interested in acquiring wealth than in gazing at the king's splendor spend all their time when they're admitted to the palace in the outer halls, gathering the treasures they find there. So engrossed are they in this that they never see the countenance of the king, the face of the king. But the wise servants, refusing to be distracted by the treasure in the halls, press on until they come to the king on his throne in the center of the palace. To their astonishment, once they reach the king's presence, they discover that the palaces, its halls, the treasures, are really only an illusion, created by the king's magical powers. In the same way, God hides himself in the garments and barriers of the cosmos and the upper worlds, where man recognizes so when he acknowledges that all is created out of God's essence and that in reality there are no barriers between man and his God. All the workers of iniquity are dispersed. So here you have a wonderful idea. You have these religious people who enter the palace of God and they get distracted by all the gold and silver that's there. This is his critique of religious behaviorism, right? You're so pedantic in your observance, you forgot that the purpose of observance is to lead you to a relationship with God. That the purpose of observance is to make of you the kind of person whom God would want to be close to. And that critique was the classic Hasidic critique. That's the classic Hasidic critique of Orthodox behaviorism. I told you this story. It's a very famous story that Heschel tells many times about a Litvak, one of my ancestors, who was a religiously pedantic Jew, right? Not me, but my ancestors, right? Speaking to a Chassid, and the Litvak says to the Chassid exactly what what the rabbi said to Jesus' followers. You Hasidim, you don't observe the law. There's a law for when you pray. There's a law for Shachris, a time for Shachris, a time for Mincha, a time for Mariv, a time for the morning prayer and the afternoon and the evening prayer. And you Hasidim, you don't observe that. And the Chassid hangs his head and says, my brother, you're absolutely right. Here's what happens. In the morning, I take my talis and my tefillin, I go to the window, I open the window, and I begin my prayers, but you know what happens? The morning floods into the room. And I see the sky brighten, and I hear the sounds of children on the way to school, and I smell the morning air, and I'm so taken with the music of the morning. I forget to say my prayers until it's too late. And then in the evening, it's time to pray. I go to the window, I open the window, I take my prayer book, I'm about to begin my prayers, and the music of the night, the peaceful night, the sky darkens, families around their hearths at home, the peacefulness of the landscape. I'm so taken with the peaceful music of the night, I forget to say my prayers. He says, tomorrow I have a solution. Tomorrow I'll close the window. And the Litvak says, God forbid, which is how you know it's a Hasidic story, right? But you hear in that story the same critique, right? That if you become so wrapped up in the doing of the deed and you miss the purpose, and the purpose is to change the heart, right? It's got to go from the outside in, but if that movement doesn't happen from outside in, if it becomes simply an act of pedantic observance, then you haven't fulfilled the real intention of the tradition. That was Matthew's critique of Pharisaic Judaism, and it's the exact same critique that the Hasidim waged. Because that's the danger. That's the danger when you have a behaviorist system of changing people's lives, right? All right, let's do one more. We okay? Everybody okay so far?
Yeah.
I've been talking a lot. Any questions? Yes, Wendy, go ahead.
It's just an asterisk.
Yeah, please.
But I see very clearly the Russian Revolution and Lenin and Marx and all them boys who were so angry about how religion was used
Yeah.
as the opiate of the masses, because it really takes away your ability to be righteously angry. It takes away your ability to be what's the word, potent.
Yeah.
And I don't mean in a sexual sense.
No. It's exactly,
No,
the Zionist revolution said the same thing.
Yeah.
The Zionists were embarrassed by the passivity of Jews in the wake of the pogroms and then ultimately the Shoah.
Right, and I guess I struggle with it.
Well, if religion becomes a replacement for acting in the world, if religion becomes a tool of separating you from the plight of people who live next door, if it becomes an isolating force, then that's not what it was for. But it has that potential because all culture has that potential.
I guess, because she's going, and I think a lot, I've always thought a lot about the Jews who said their prayers, who were faithful as they marched. And I wonder, really?
Yeah.
This is the God, this is why I don't come to shul.
Well, but think for just a moment. I understand the critique, and I don't want to get into it now. But what you can think about is the following, Wendy. Ready? Think about the following. And suppose they didn't have that faith.
Then at least
Even
you
say-
say,
No, but even that, at least that faith gave them as much strength as you can have under those circumstances. It's not so clear an indictment because you and I stand outside that circumstance and can make judgments.
yes,
From inside that circumstance, very different kinds of judgments. Very different kind of judgments. And at least those people had a mechanism of some hope in a completely hopeless circumstance. A completely hopeless circumstance. So let's talk about this in another moment. Yes, please.
I understand your criticism of the outside in. Now
Not mine, it's the Hasidic. I didn't say a thing today.
What you're explaining.
Yeah.
But now I want to understand a little about criticism of the inside out.
Well-
When somebody says, I'm a good person, I don't need to observe Shabbos. I'm a good person, what's the point of kashrut?
Right.
I'm a good person,
Right.
what's the point of this? And then you end up getting we're no longer Jewish.
Well, that's half of it. The rabbis rejected it because they believed that's not how people change. That's not how, you can't change people's character from the inside out. It doesn't work that way, right? Partly because emotions are impulses and they're very hard to control. They're very, very hard to control. And the rabbis chose a behaviorist model for changing human behavior because they felt in the end it would be more effective. It's a more effective way. Maimonides talks about character traits as habits. He says if you want to have a generous child, you can talk all you want to a child about generosity, and the kid isn't going to be generous. If you want to raise a generous child, bring the child with you and give tzedakah. Give charity. You give charity. By the third time, it's something that the kid begins expecting to do. And giving charity becomes part of the pattern of that person's life, and eventually that person behaves as if. In the 12-step program, which is also highly behavioral, you fake it till you make it. Right? You may still crave alcohol, but you don't drink today. You may still not be the gentle person you want to be, but you practice a certain ethic of gentility, trying slowly to change your insight. You change a person from the outside in. That was the rabbinic insight, right? Based on the Torah too, by the way. That's how the Torah is organized. You know, it's naseh v'nishma, doing it and then it becomes part of you, right? That's the rabbinic insight. The Christian insight is the Jeremiah prophecy, which is you change people by focusing on the inner life. And I think each religion needs to create a sort of dialectic between the two. As you well know, Christianity developed its own code of halacha, right? I mean, the Catholic Church certainly has a very strong set of canon law and practices and ways of doing things and rituals, right? And there too you could launch, in fact, the Protestant Reformation asked the question, have you forgotten the inner person, right? Right? And the Jewish tradition also maintained a concern for the inner life. So this dialectic is part of religion. This dialectic of inside-outside is always part of religion. You going to add something?
Well, you brought it up. The Torah says first you shall do and then you shall know.
They said, it says we're going to do and we're going to know, yeah.
I mean, that's
right.
like, isn't that revolutionary?
It's not. It's very insightful. It's a sort of insightful way of how to. And look, all of us, if you've ever tried to do it, it's really hard to change yourself. I don't know if we talk about tshuva around the Yom Kippur holiday, right? You're gonna do tshuva, right? I've always said to people, don't like change one thing. Don't change everything. My brother's a diet doc. My brother has a PhD in psychology. God help him, and he's a diet doctor for many years. He worked in a diet clinic. He did a major study of diet programs. You know the story. 99.8% of the weight that people take off, they put back on and more. All right? So which program do you think it is that keeps the weight off best? And this is important Jewish things to know. Right? Nutrisystem, what's the other one?
Weight Watchers.
Yeah, well, the answer is Weight Watchers. Because Weight Watchers doesn't put you on a diet, it teaches you a new way of eating. And Weight Watchers is intensely Jewish, by the way. First of all, it has a ritual. It's obsessive in its rituals, right? You have to cut 2 ounces and 3 ounces, you're weighing food, and then you go to a ritual every week where they weigh you and they give a prayer, oh Lord, no donuts, mine, that sort of. But it's very Jewish. It's set up by 2 Jewish ladies my brother described, and the reason is because until you change the way that a person behaves in the world, and it has to be very small incremental changes, that's how you change a person's life, right? You don't change a whole life all at once. Judith, go ahead.
Well, I'm really resonating with this inside-outside. I struggle a lot because I have a son in Israel who was very influenced by Torah, loves his Judaism, but is modern Orthodox.
Yeah.
Here's an example.
That's good.
He was doing, because my husband died a year ago, he was every day, doing his prayers. And he misunderstood the last day, and he stopped too soon. When he found out he stopped too soon, he was in such pain about this, and such agony. And I thought, what is this? It's the same point you're making. It's like the emphasis on the outside. And really, his heart was in the right place. That's what mattered.
Yeah.
And that really has made a big impact on me.
Right.
In terms of my trying to reconnect my own feelings.
Right. It's inside outside. Yeah. They're trying to figure out what religion is for. Elon.
So we have an evangelical Christian at our Pesach on the second night.
Uh-huh.
And she was expressing her deep love for all of us, just internal deep love that, as I've heard from them before. But what struck struck me is that it was a content-free love. So it's like changing, they're very internal, or at least this one was, but it's like, where's the basis for any of it?
Yeah. On the other hand, I sort of like Jews to talk that way a little bit. I'd like Jews to talk about their love for each other a little more. I read the Jewish Journal, and all I hear is anger at each other, you know. And I think that we could. I think we could use a dose of, even if it is superficial. At least it sounds so different than the. I mean, because Jews are, I love you, but I'll tell you what's wrong with you. You know, that's a Jewish move, right? I love you, and I'll tell you what's wrong with you. Because I love you, I'm going to tell you. You know. And this, I don't you think? Don't you think? You know, anyway. Mark, yeah.
Okay. So, I think,
It's good, he went almost an hour. I mean,
because I was really overwhelmed by the beauty
yeah,
and the truth
yeah,
of how you have explained that the Christian story
yeah.
is pretty much identical to the Jewish story.
Not identical,
And
no.
Very, very close.
No, it's derivative of the Jewish story. It came from the Jewish story.
But in a very real way, the same story with different emphasis.
Okay,
That was very good.
yeah.
However,
I knew that I couldn't save your soul, Brother Gelman.
However, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah,
In what respects
Yeah.
and to what extent
right.
these stories are irreconcilably different.
All right, so look at the last page. Look at the last page. Here's why.
Matthew 20.
Matthew 21, then 28, right? All right, first Matthew 21, right? All right, so Matthew, as I said, I think Matthew's a Jew. I think Matthew's talking to Jews. I think Matthew is trying to accomplish what the rabbis of the Mishnah were trying to accomplish, trying to save his community, having experienced the loss of its principal institution. And I think that he finds this narrative compelling. And the rabbis use other ethics and other narratives, okay? The emphasis on halakha, behavior, is very different than the emphasis on an internal thing. But here's where it really diverts between the two, okay? Listen to another parable, he says. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, built a watchtower. He rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized the servants, they beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir, come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? Okay? And this is Jesus speaking to his disciples. The disciples respond, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied. He will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? The Lord has done this, it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruits. He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. What's he saying?
You're toast, Jews.
Yeah, this is Matthew saying, in the end, I tried to save my people and I failed. So now I'm telling you that you are no longer the people of God. Those who follow the Christ will be the people of God. You killed the prophets, that's the servants, and you killed the son. And by the way, you killed him, right? This is the beginning of that libel. You killed him. And therefore, you have lost your favor in God's eyes, right? And someone else who's more faithful will take over from you.
But that's still the Jewish story.
Right? No,
No,
but it was never an abrogation of the covenant. This is an abrogation of covenant. This is the covenant you had with your fathers is canceled. You canceled it.
transferring of the ownership of the vineyard.
Yes, that's the point, to somebody else. to somebody else completely. And so at the end of the book, remember at the beginning we read this idea that don't go to the non-Jews, don't go to the Samaritans, this message is only for the Jews? Look what happens at the end of the book. Then Jesus said to them, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me.
That's the thing.
Well, that's coming. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. I surely am one with you always to the very end of the age.
That's the difference.
All right? So what's the difference?
The
Articulate.
difference is Jews teach in the name of a teacher. He said, beginning at the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it said,
Right.
but I say.
Okay.
No Jew teaches that way.
Okay.
They would say, in the name of my teacher, who taught in the name of this, who taught in the name of Hillel, and therefore we do.
Yeah.
So he's usurping
Mhm.
traditional rabbinic authority.
All right. So that's one of the differences.
Secondly,
Yeah.
is, of course, the idea of vicarious atonement. That,
That's not in this book
I
yet.
understand.
That's not here yet. That's from a different place.
Yeah.
That's a different voice. That's not in Matthew.
I understand,
Yeah.
but the difference is that there is a way to atone for sin that doesn't involve
Tshuva.
repentance.
Right.
The third is, of course, that there's two ways to see the law, as you mentioned.
Right.
One is, oh, this inspires me to do more mitzvahs.
Right.
And the second is Paul's way, which is, I'm completely overwhelmed.
Right.
I am doomed. And unless I am saved by a power greater than the law,
Right.
I will be doomed to eternal damnation.
All right, so let me follow up on Rabbi Gelman's comments. So the other voices entered into the Christian story, entered into the Christian conversation, which turned it from a Jewish story into a very non-Jewish story. The elevating of Christ into a God figure, Son of God. The notion that the death of Christ cleanses you of your sins, right? The notion that he speaks only in his own authority and not in the authority of Torah. These are elements which are not Jewish and are contrary to the Jewish tradition. I think that Matthew, I'm going to give you a slightly different story. I think that Matthew is a Jew. And I think this chapter also represents, I'm not sure about 28. That sounds to me suspiciously like John. But 21 sounds to me a lot like Matthew. And it sounds to me like a kind of Jew that I've met many times who gives up on his Judaism. He looks at the world after a lifetime of trying to save his people and says, they can't be saved. I failed, right? Maybe because I hang out with a lot of rabbis who end up retiring and having trouble, but there's a sense of failure. You can be healed, brother. You can be healed, brother. I'll be in Curacao. It'll be fine. There's a despair here. Do you hear it? There's a giving up, right? The owner of the vineyard sent servants. The tenants killed the servants. The owner of the vineyard sent the son. The son gets killed. The owner of the vineyard says, I'm going to take it away from you and give it to somebody else. That's something that a Jewish teacher, if a Jewish teacher said that, it would be a tremendous betrayal. Because one of the themes of the Torah over and over again is, you get another chance. You get a second chance. Yes, we screwed up this year. I mean, that's what Yom Kippur is all about, right? Yes, we screwed up. Give us another chance. And there never is a sort of finishing point where you say, you have so destroyed the relationship between you and God that it can't be fixed anymore, that the covenant is destroyed. If you look down here, I gave you two sources here. This is sort of the rabbinic response to that belief, right? The first one was a very famous saying in Talmud Yoma. The first temple was destroyed because of the sins of idolatry, sexual indecency, and murder. In other words, the temple itself became a place of sin. It became an obstacle and not an instrument of coming close to God. Therefore, it needed to be destroyed. The second temple, in spite of widespread study of Torah and performance of commandments and deeds of compassion during its existence, fell because of boundless hatred. Sinat chinam. And therefore, boundless hatred is a sin that weighs as heavily as idolatry. Now, the notion that the temple was destroyed, not to destroy the relationship between Israel and God, but because we couldn't get along as a community. We couldn't live together as a community. But that's something now we have to work on. I mean, the idea is that now you have to do tshuva for that sin, right? And there's another little source here where the king destroys the palace of his son, but says, I'll build him another one. Jews have never given up hope. And the problem with this parable is that it's a parable of hopelessness. You violated the covenant and God got impatient with you. If there's one thing you learn from reading the Torah is that we did some terrible things to God, and God says, I'll give you another chance. That's what, if you get into the shul right now when we do the Torah reading today is the section that comes right after the golden calf, right? Which is as bad a sin as it gets. And God says, all right, we'll fix this. That hopelessness, I think, is one of the differences. That sense that God gives up on anybody, right? I don't think that Jews ever believe that. What? That wasn't God giving up on, that's not a punishment from God, right? What's interesting there is the opposite, Stephen, is that Jews didn't give up on God after the Holocaust. That's what's really interesting. No, but that's what Wendy was saying before about people had some faith. Some did, but the idea that we never gave up being Jews, to me, is a great miracle. So I want to suggest here what we have is the following, that at least in the Jewish strata of the Christian story, you have a marvelous conversation between two religious communities, struggling with catastrophe and trying to find how do you come close to God in a very, very, very broken world. And those two communities had a lot more to say to each other than they did for the rest of history. At the beginning, they had a lot to say to each other because they were really speaking a very common language about how do you come close to God in a time of catastrophe. We're going to finish now. You're welcome to come in the shul and enjoy the service, and we'll see each other next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Didn't we start talking again after Vatican II?
Yeah, Vatican. Yes, please take one. Yeah.
My question